Colleagues, good morning and welcome. All very quiet, very quickly. I appreciate that as a high school teacher. I'd like to see that level of obedience. Welcome and good morning. A special welcome to our online and international delegates from across Australia and throughout the world. So 12 countries as well as Australia are joining us today, which I think is fantastic. I'm Braden Hill. I'm very proud to be the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Students, Equity and Indigenous at Edith Cowan University in Perth. You might have heard of it. And I'll be your MC today, whether you like it or not. And I say that because a couple of years ago I came to give a keynote and I got to wear this headset. And it was quite a moment for me because I got to live, as I said at the time, my Britney Spears fantasy. It's my pop star moment. So back then, I had my 15 minutes of Text of Fame, and I'm back to hog it for an entire day now. So, as I said, I was hooked and I'm here whether you like it or not. But I'm really delighted to welcome you all to TEXA 2024 conference. Before I kick off, just a few housekeeping notes. In case of emergency, if we're required to evacuate, please follow the Sofitel staff and their instructions. If you require assistance throughout the day or medical assistance, please see the wonderful people at the registration desk who greeted you when you came in. Throughout today for Q&A, we're going to be using Slido, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Now, to post a question, please scan the QR code that you'll see behind me. And you'll see this around the room all throughout today. The participant code is TEXA24. You just select the session title and then Q&A. For those joining us virtually, we'll pop in a link into the chat so you have the opportunity to ask your questions there. And also you can upvote questions that are good questions, so feel free to get involved in that way too. You can choose to leave your name if you like. You can also choose to leave it anonymous. Also wanted to point out Alice from livedrawing.com, who's capturing a lot of today's illustrations. Please welcome Alice. In an age of AI, it's wonderful to support creative arts and creativity, so thanks for coming along, Alice, and we're going to see the wonderful drawings that she produces today outside. Now, without further ado, it's really important, as a Noongar man from Western Australia, to welcome Warringi Elder Uncle Perry Wandin. So if you wouldn't mind coming up, please welcome Perry.
Well, Majinka, everybody. As you heard, my name's Perry Wandin, Warringi Elder. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge all my ancestors, elders both past, present and emerging, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Welcome everybody. This is Naarm, Melbourne, as we know in our language. So my family have all been brought beautifully on this country of ours, which sadly there were 35 men, women and children left when colonisation come in. So as you could think, from thousands to that and back to thousands of who we are today. But where all my family come from, especially my grandfather, is Corranderk Mission. Usually it's only supposed to be 1 hour drive. But coming into Melbourne now, it could be up to an hour and a half and 2. So it's Hillsville in the Yarra Valley. Corranderk Mission put in place 1863 to 1924. By 1924, there were 424 Aboriginal people living there. So anybody that come into Naarm, Melbourne, any Aboriginal person were ushered straight off to Corranderk, told, sorry, that's where you live now, don't go anywhere. So my grandfather was born at Corranderk, one of 10 siblings, and he signed up to go to World War I. So they just let him go because they one less mouth to feed. Because being genocide was happening and anything they could do to get rid of Aboriginal people. So my grandfather went away, come back. The government had just made a new law, half-caste rule, sorry. He wasn't allowed to go back on the mission. He had to get permission to even go and see his family. So resided in Hillsville, smart man, 6 generations later, we haven't moved. So you think of that and the rest of our family, how they've gone through, because Robert Wandoon was his father. Today the family name's Wandin, and the town Wandin's named after my great-grandfather. Because William Barrick, who we just got paintings back 18 months ago, I think, from United States, and a shield, it tells us the story of William Barrack in 1870 really it was a dance for the women, Tanderrum. And from that, we're going to get a statue in which Wurundjeri just won the award for the exhibition of the art of being exhibited in the State Library and the Melbourne Museum. So there's a lot to go on. William Barrack's sister had my great-grandfather, Robert Wandoon, and she fell pregnant. And the reason why was one of the farmers, so they tried to keep it. And we're gradually doing little bits and pieces and finding out who the family was. Because, well, that is family. As you can see, my mother was English. My father thought, I'm not going to worry about sort of what's going on here. I fell in love with an English woman. Her name was Olive Potter, and I had a grandfather called Harry Potter. So I got a bit of a story to tell you on both sides. But as we are today, we're very proud. My father was our last Narangita, passed now for 19 years, and first Aboriginal player to play for St Kilda. So if you're looking for a team, people online, overseas, St Kilda, red, white, black. Okay, just remember that. I hope you, Brandon, who do you vote for, West Coast?
Eagles and Dogs.
Yeah, well, bus is waiting out the front, mate. But no, everybody, I hope you enjoy yourselves. Look, it's just about the end of the year. We are a very big, strong mob now, and we're going down native title. It's a bit of a battle. But look, I hope everyone stays safe for the rest of the year. So, Wominjeka, everybody, welcome. Yumi Kundi Bik, Wurundjeri Wurrung, meaning welcome to the land of Wurundjeri people. I do welcome you, and please stay safe over the holidays. Thank you.
Thanks, Uncle Perry, for that. And before he goes, I'll say, Kaya nang jurpa mama jinunul nidja, nyang karich Wurundjeri bidia, bunarong bidia kura ye. I want to pay my respects to your elders past and present, and as a Noongar person, I'm very delighted to be here and be welcomed, as we all are. So one last round of applause for Uncle Perry. Okay, so this year's theme is Navigating Tomorrow, Anticipating Challenges and Embracing Change, and I wanted to reflect on that a little bit. Now, I mentioned artificial intelligence, our new best friend, potential future overlord as well. It is indeed transforming the way we work, teach, and learn. I think we had some wonderful conversations in yesterday's session about that. And it might be faster than us, and it might be accurate at a bunch of things, but I really don't think it can navigate university governance or politics just yet. Or, as Kath pointed out yesterday, a padlocked viva voce. So clearly we've got it's got some work to do. I'm really interested, though, when we think about AI and how it can replicate much of our logic and rationality, I think it's a really good time for us as a sector to reflect on and potentially rediscover our deep sense of responsibility for one another and that connection not only to each other but the world around us, and share that with our students. And I think that's a really interesting challenge that we have ahead of us. We also, of course, are contending with the challenge of international student caps, a balancing act that I think makes academic workloads look like a walk in the park. But it's one that's on the horizon, and one that we're grappling with. Simultaneously, I think institutions are challenged by a decreasing trust in higher education, and Australia really is not immune from that. And a lot of our public, our citizens, are concerned that higher education prioritises revenue over the work of education. I think that's a real challenge that we see on the horizon. And this asks us, I think, to really reflect on what is it that universities are for, because that's the question that we're being asked. And I think we can't really have very neat, clear answers to a bunch of people who have very diverse requirements, aspirations, and needs when it comes to our sector. And I think social licence is something, a conversation that we're having. What is the social licence of higher education and universities, particularly in this country? And I think it's a question, it's a licence that we have to continually renew. It's not like a kid's pen licence in primary school. It's something we have to continually earn. We're also navigating politics on campus in a world that's more connected than ever before, but potentially more polarised. And we're having to ask ourselves, what does social cohesion mean in the face of conflicting views, but also conflicting worldviews? And how do we foster space for deep listening and dialogue when perspectives clash? What does that mean for us in the here and now? So there's some of the key challenges. I know we're going to explore a lot of these today, but here's the thing. My reflection is that universities and places of learning that pre-existed universities have always been good at anticipating challenges and what's ahead. They're spaces that teach us how to think, not what to think, foster resilience in the face of the unknown. So I'm really excited to open the proceedings and very excited to get on with it before AI decides it can do a better Britney Spears impersonation than what I can. So I'd really like to welcome our keynote who is joining us. Danielle Wood is the chair of the Productivity Commission. Who's delivering our keynote this morning. Danielle commenced a 5-year term as the Chair of Productivity Commission on the 13th of November 2023, so year anniversary. Prior to joining the Commission, she was CEO of the Grattan Institute and head of its budgets and government program. During her time there, Danielle also held roles as member of the Australian Government Women's Economic Equality Task Force, the Parliamentary Budget Office Expert Advisory Committee, the Jobs and Skills Australia Consultative Forum, and the Research Committee of the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. Danielle previously worked in senior roles at the ACCC, as well as at the National Economic Research Associates Consulting. She started her degree as a graduate at the Productivity Commission as well. She holds an honours degree in economics from the University of Adelaide and 2 master's degrees, one in economics and one in competition law from the University of Melbourne. She is also an honorary fellow and former president of the Economic Society of Australia and a research fellow at the Women's Leadership Institute. She was the co-founder and first chair of the Women in Economics Network. Please welcome Danielle.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Braden. I don't get to do the Britney Spears impersonation, so hopefully everyone can hear me through the mics. And I am honoured to stand here on beautiful Wurundjeri land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank you to Uncle Perry for that lovely welcome to country. Now, I hope everyone has had their first coffee, because we are getting started with a speech on productivity. And I do think there is something, maybe the conference programmers thought you needed to eat your greens before you got to your desserts. Metaphorical desserts, of course, being the minister and the other great speakers in the program. But I do hope to convince you that productivity is its own treat. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Lucas says, once one starts to think about economic growth, it is hard to think about anything else. So beyond hopefully convincing you that productivity matters, I want to focus on the role of our higher education sector as engines of productivity. And I want to issue a challenge to everyone in the room today, whether you're in administration, teaching, research, regulation, as I know a lot of you are. Australia needs our universities to step up their own productivity performance to deliver more of the research and quality teaching for us to thrive in coming decades. So, why should we care about productivity? Productivity sounds scary, but it's ultimately just about improving our living standards. If we can produce more goods and services with fewer resources than before, that is productivity growth. The effects of that over time are enormous. So if I take you back to 1901 in Australia, it took 18 minutes of the average worker's time to afford a standard loaf of bread. Today, that is 4 minutes of work time. The productivity improvement amongst our bread makers means that we all get to consume a lot more bread, if you're me, or if you're more carb conscious, you can spend that extra money that you would have spent on bread elsewhere. And of course, it's not just bread production that's been revolutionised. A theatre ticket cost an average worker 320 minutes of work in 1901, today 62 minutes. A bicycle, 473 hours of work in 1901. Today, 6 hours. And even to put the very real concerns about today's rental market into perspective, the typical Australian now works 9 hours a week to afford a rental. It was 20 hours in 1901. Wherever you look, productivity progress has improved our capacity to deliver the goods and services that we value. That productivity growth has seen real per-person incomes improve by more than 700% since Federation, while also giving us an extra 13 hours a week to leisure. But let me engage here with a common argument dismissing the importance of productivity. According to the doubters, productivity might deliver more stuff, but does not deliver better lives or improved well-being. I would mostly disagree with that assessment. It is certainly true that productivity won't tuck your kids into bed at night, but it has delivered a lot more than just extra bread or bicycles. Growth is correlated with so many of the things that we care about: longer, healthier lives, better education, more and more varied leisure time, and better and more stable political institutions. Many of these things are supported by growth, but also support growth themselves. And as I'll come to shortly, that is very much the case with education. That's why it's not surprising that richer countries tend to have higher average life satisfaction, and those countries that experience sustained economic growth over time see their average levels of satisfaction increase. That said, economists recognise that growth is not a measure of everything we care about. Some things are hard to measure well, like the quality of care services. Important determinants of well-being, like community involvement and quality of relationships, are missed altogether. But no one can or should deny that growth matters. Now, I probably don't need to tell people in this audience, but Australia's recent productivity performance hasn't been much of a cause for celebration. Productivity went on a roller coaster ride during COVID. In the first 2 years of the pandemic, productivity rose strongly. That may seem counterintuitive, but essentially it was because social distancing restrictions reduced hours the most in lower productivity services sectors. But that bubble was in no way sustainable. At the end of the restrictions, working hours expanded, pushed productivity in the opposite direction. The bubble burst. The strong performance of the labour market through much of 2022 and 2023 has also put downward pressure on productivity during this period. Let me be totally clear, strong labour markets are a great thing, but the surge in hours worked that we've seen in the COVID recovery was quick and large. Investment and the capital stock hasn't kept up, and that puts downward pressure on productivity growth. So I think of this in a way, the economy is the cobra, COVID shock is the rat. We've swallowed it, and it is just taking a while to pass its way through the system. But this begs the question, what is the economy recovering to? Even before the COVID roller coaster, all was not well. In the decade sandwiched between the GFC and COVID, Australia's annual productivity growth averaged just 1.1%, the lowest of the last 6 decades and well below its 60-year average. And this slowdown in productivity growth is not just an Australian phenomenon. Almost every OECD nation experienced a substantial decline in labour productivity in the 15 years prior to COVID compared to the previous 15. Across the OECD, labour productivity halved during this period. A range of credible explanations have been put forward as to what's going on. Growth in the lower productivity services sectors, declining gains from education, smaller contribution from technological change, as hard as that might be to believe, reduced economic dynamism and increased risk aversion by business and capital owners. So what I want to focus on here today are the two that are most relevant to our higher education sector: declining gains from education and a declining contribution from innovation. And I want to discuss how people in this room can help turn them around. Universities contribute a huge amount to our intellectual, our social and our cultural lives. But you have an economist here today, so I'm going to talk about the ways in which universities contribute to our long-term productivity performance. There are, I think, 3 major channels. First, through building the skills and capability of our future workforce, what we tend to call the human capital of our population. Second, by generating the research and ideas that lead to better processes and new and improved goods and services. And third, through building ties, building that understanding and goodwill with people from other nations, which contributes to ongoing global integration, whether through trade, investment, or the flow of ideas. But let me start with the fundamental role that universities play in educating our population. Over the past 30 years, education levels across the Australian population have soared. In the early 1980s, about 1 in 10 25 to 34-year-olds held a university qualification. Today, that figure is 45%. Part of this increase has been driven by a strong migration program that has encouraged skilled migrants to settle on our shores. But it points as well to a large and sustained expansion in the number of Australians going to university. The resultant improvement in so-called labour quality, and apologies for these sort of dry economics terms, had played an important role in productivity growth, particularly as other contributors have stalled. University degrees are associated with better employment outcomes and higher earnings over people's lifetimes, even after adjusting for individual characteristics. And although the graduate premium is in decline, it is still significant across the lifetime. Higher levels of education in our working population improves wages and productivity through a few channels. First, people who hold a tertiary qualification tend to have higher cognitive performance than others their own age, even after you control for the fact that more clever people will tend to go on to study at higher levels. Perhaps just as importantly, people with higher education are more likely to do on-the-job training when they're in the workforce. They have learnt how to learn. And there's growing evidence that going to university improves broader skills like ability to cooperate and work in a team. Education can also improve people's capacity to innovate. Increases in the supply of educated workers and managers leads to greater direct innovation by firms. Those educated workers are also more likely to adopt new innovations from elsewhere in doing their job. This link between education and the innovation mindset is critical if we are going to supercharge the productivity upside from education, and I'll come back to that point. There are still gains to be eked out from expanding Australians' access to higher education, despite the huge expansion over recent decades. As the Productivity Commission noted in our 2023 productivity inquiry, there is no evidence that we've reached the point where the cost of education for marginal workers outweighs the benefit received by them and by society. According to Jobs and Skills Australia, more than 9 out of 10 new jobs will require a post-school qualification over the next decade, and around 50% of those will require a bachelor's degree. The recent Universities Accord argued that government should continue to promote participation in university and vocational education and set ambitious targets for governments to boost attainment rates by 2050. The benefits of higher education are why the PC has supported a return to a system of uncapped demand-driven funding. But even with this potential upside, the huge ramp up in the education levels of the population will not be repeated. This means that the contribution of gains from the quantity of education in our productivity numbers is likely to be more subdued in coming decades than in previous ones. And that brings the quality of education into sharper focus. Improving education quality means improving outcomes for students for a given level of investment. That begs the question, how are we currently faring? As I already mentioned, university graduates have good labour market outcomes in the medium term compared to those who acquire skills via vet or school alone, even adjusting for student characteristics. Australian universities also perform well on student-assessed measures of quality. Indeed, the average university brings home a 76%, which I call just scraping through with a distinction, on overall experience for undergraduate students. On assessed teaching quality, 80%, a pretty solid mark. Further, when we look at measures of employer satisfaction, overall satisfaction with graduates sits just below 84% and has remained strong over time. But despite those good results, there are reasons to be vigilant. Despite the strong average student-assessed quality scores, there is a fair degree of variation across institutions, as you can see. There is also some stickiness in the outcomes data, suggesting a lack of course correction. If we measure over a 4-year period, the universities that start with the highest share of students nominating their quality as excellent tend to stay excellent, while those with the lowest shares tend to stay at the bottom. And employers report much lower levels of satisfaction with collaboration skills of graduates who study entirely remotely. This matters because these social skills are increasingly demanded by employers as a complement to technical skills. So when it comes to quality, I think there are a few things we need to do. The first is to keep working through the impact of online course delivery for student learning. And I know this has been a focus for TEXA. Research suggests hybrid and online learning can work very well, but it takes upfront investments in technologies and new teaching practices. Shifting what we are doing face-to-face directly to the computer screen is less effective. The dreaded blank sea of Zoom screens is not ideal for either students or teachers. More broadly, we need to address the lack of direct incentives for teachers and universities to improve teacher quality. We are used to looking at star ratings or Google reviews when we book a hotel or restaurant, but prospective students usually don't see the ratings data from QILT when choosing between courses. Even when they do, the data isn't as informative as it could be. This lack of visibility combines with other factors. A general sense that teaching holds less prestige than research and government funding less prestige than research and government funding settings that fail to reward quality. All act to weaken the incentives for the best teaching. Of course, the Higher Education Standards Framework under the TEXA Act sets quality requirements for course design, learning resources and educational outcomes, and TEXA plays a key role in upholding these principles. But we need to do more to ensure that every teacher is delivering to a high standard. The PC's put forward a range of recommendations for change. An important one is making lecture and course materials publicly available. Letting the public see behind the university's high walls would sharpen the incentives for quality teaching, allow students to make better decisions around what courses might match their interests, and assist in lifetime learning, giving those not looking for an accreditation access to an endless supply of learning opportunities. Another recommendation we made is for TEXA to undertake broad quality reviews of teaching practices at a university by university level, similar to what happens in Scotland. This model would give TEXA the power to appoint a team of staff and students to do a deep dive into their institution's arrangements for improving student learning and engagement. This kind of lighter touch review is less detailed than external or peer review at a subject level, but it provides useful insights into how teaching quality is tracking across an institution. Lastly, TEXA has an important role to play in leading and disseminating best practice across the higher education sector. I know the PC has been a big user of the good practice and guidance notes in our own research on what works. We're very much looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the current review of universities' AI plans. We wondered if building these to include a good practice note on quality teaching would also be valuable. Overall, our goal has to be to ensure that teaching excellence is at the heart of our universities, because this is what we'll need if we're going to sustain the big improvements in quality needed for future productivity gains. So I want to turn now to another critical way in which universities impact our prosperity, which is in their roles as vectors for innovation. It is technological change that drives most productivity improvements over time, and it is ideas that make technological change possible. Economics professor Danielle Wood has argued that asking how do we generate more growth is essentially the same as asking how do we generate more ideas. And what are our universities if not factories for ideas? It is worth remembering that when I'm talking about ideas, it's not just the kind of novel frontier research that some university researchers might be engaged in. New to world innovation is only about 2% of the Australian innovation story. Diffusion, the application of existing knowledge to different businesses and contexts, is also a crucial part of the puzzle. Innovation for the 98% must be a focus of research efforts and graduate skill sets. So universities spend more than they used to on research activity. Total university research expenditure has increased fivefold since the early 1990s, although growth has slowed somewhat in recent years, as you can see. This ramp up in spending over decades is repeated across much of the developed world, but it hasn't generated the ideas boom we might have hoped. For example, if we look to the US, we can see that the number of people employed in research roles has grown 23-fold since the 1930s, a huge expansion in research effort. But measured by the economic outputs of this research, productivity of that research has declined 41-fold, or a growth rate of minus 5.1% per year on average. This tale of more and more effort for less and less return has played out across a huge range of innovation areas. Take Moore's law, the tendency for the number of transistors fitted on an integrated circuit to double every 2 years. It is, on the face of it, a remarkable testament to our capacity for innovation. But the number of researchers required to bring about this result has grown to be 18 times higher than it was in 1971. Agricultural crop yields are improving at a relatively constant or slightly declining rate, but the number of agricultural researchers required to achieve this has doubled. In drug discovery, the number of new drugs approved per $1 billion spent on R&D halves every 9 years or so. It's a phenomenon that has been dubbed a Room's law, which is Moore's law spelt backwards. At the heart of this slowdown in research productivity is that researchers inevitably solve the easier problems first, making gains harder once the lowest hanging fruit has been picked. Indeed, being better than the Beatles is a challenge that confounds across so many research areas. But even noting and accepting this difficulty, there is still scope to improve the productivity of the research projects in ways that could help generate and diffuse new ideas. Australia is unusual in that university-led research makes up a relatively large percentage of our national R&D expenditure. Indeed, as a share of GDP, universities chip in more for research and development than universities in the US and Korea, and certainly well above the OECD average. The good news is that our university research is top-notch on academic metrics. Despite our small population, we have the 5th highest number of highly cited researchers in the world, and 84% of our research is rated at or above world standard. Australian researchers are more likely than those in the US or the EU to collaborate with international scholars. But there is still more we need to do. There is a widely held view that Australian business collaboration with universities is poor. This perception is backed up by the numbers. Data from the ABS suggests that less than 10% of innovating firms get their ideas from universities. And as much as policymakers say they want universities and businesses to talk more, clearly the incentives are not there yet to bring everyone to the table. The Accord recognised the importance of nationally relevant research in its recommendation for a new Solving Australian Challenges Fund, which would reward universities that apply their research capabilities to meeting Australia's big national challenges. Even where research turns up potentially useful ideas for Australian businesses or policymakers, we can do more to put them into practice. Governments have long grappled with reducing barriers to research commercialisation, such as IP licensing, or academic spin-offs or joint ventures, but only partly successfully. The PC has found we should be doing more to encourage knowledge transfers by encouraging labour mobility between industry and academia. We can also help businesses tap into the experience and knowledge of academic researchers by reducing barriers to academic consulting, which is too often held up by administrative roadblocks. There is also more to do on the productivity of the ideas generation process itself. Long and expensive processes for grants can reduce bang for buck and slow the research process. US research on the peer-reviewed grant-making process concluded that the tax of application processes may be up to 45% of researcher time. Further, these processes can skew or bias research efforts in a number of ways. Towards more incremental research with a higher likelihood of surviving review compared to riskier or novel research, against interdisciplinary research, and towards researchers with a history of successful applications. It does not take long in a conversation with Australian academics to degenerate into a similar set of complaints. The recent Accord process suggests universities should be paid for the indirect cost of applying for nationally competitive research grants. And the Australian Research Council recently took the positive step of introducing an expression of interest round for its discovery grant applications. But future work may be necessary to explore alternative models like science lotteries to continue tackling these challenges. The final way in which universities contribute to Australia's productivity and overall well-being is through promoting strong ties with the world. Australia has benefited enormously in an economic sense from globalisation. Our strong skilled migration program has helped ease the fiscal challenges of an ageing population and boosted labour market productivity and outcomes. Migration is also associated with increased innovation, with evidence suggesting that migrants are more likely to patent new innovations. Moreover, the open rules-based trading system has supported a healthy growth in our export sectors, including higher education, and a much broader range of lower cost and high quality products for Australian consumers. But as the forces of deglobalisation, or at least fragmentation, build around the world, Australia's soft ties become even more important. The Colombo Plan in the 1950s brought tens of thousands of future Asian leaders to study at Australian tertiary institutions over decades. Many of those leaders went on to work in key positions, giving Australia a crucial soft power through the region. In more recent times, we have the new Colombo Plan, scholarships for Australians to go and study in neighbouring countries and bring back what they learn, as well, of course, as our vast network of international graduates who continue to take their connection to Australia back home with them. These links build ties across our regions and can occur even when domestic students don't study overseas themselves. I reflect here on the story of Australian economist Professor Sean Turnell, famous for being held unjustly in a Myanmar jail for 2 years. Professor Turnell studied the Myanmar economy over decades. He worked there as an economic advisor. How does a Macquarie Uni economics student end up being a world expert in the Myanmar economy? The answer was getting to know the then Burmese students as an undergraduate at Macquarie Uni, which led to Sean's lifelong interest in the country and its people. In a world with greater barriers to flows of trade, people and ideas, I believe that the understanding and communication created by student flows will be important for ensuring these roadblocks do not become high walls to international engagement. But to return to my theme of quality, the quality of the student experience in Australia is crucial for the strength of these ties. Soft power relies on both warmth of feeling and the willingness to have ongoing interactions. So this is just another case to put quality front and centre. Where to from here? I realise today, and as Braden said, I am speaking to a sector that is working through some fairly significant challenges. The COVID shock, the roller coaster ride of closing then reopening international borders, obviously with flow-on effects for international student numbers, was clearly hugely challenging. Universities are on the front line of major technological change in both the shift to online teaching and the growing adoption of generative AI in learning and research. Those challenges have been amplified by big and disruptive policy changes over a short period. The Jobs Ready graduate package, a suite of regulatory reforms to student migration settings, and now the proposal for international student caps. The university's Accord process, generally a constructive policy exercise, is also starting to flow through to policy. But it has raised fundamental questions about the university business model and the extent to which we can continue to rely on international student revenue to cross-subsidise research activity. I'm here today to say that the payoff from getting the policy settings and the internal culture right are high. Universities hold in their hands three crucially important ingredients for national productivity: the skills of our labour force, the generation and diffusion of ideas, and the breadth and quality of our international networks. Gains in these areas are becoming harder to come by. That might naturally push the sector to look for more resources, but I'm also here to encourage you to look for improvements via productivity at home. Promoting teaching excellence, widely sharing learning, supporting research with Australian impacts, and providing a great educational experience for our overseas students are just some of the ways in which Australia's universities can shape a more productive future for Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. We do have some time for questions, so I will remind you that the Slido app is there, so feel free to pop some in there. But I do have a couple, Danielle. Now, I mentioned I'm a high school teacher. I'm really interested in your thoughts about what the role secondary education plays in addressing some of the challenges that you've spoken to, including VET as well as universities. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I have spoken to the vet sector before, and they lament on the challenge of students coming through often with quite low levels of literacy and numeracy, and that then puts the pressure on those providers to build those sort of foundational skills before you start talking about the more tertiary skills that you would expect the sector to be focusing on. When we look at some of the data on foundational schools in secondary education, what we have seen is actually a decline in literacy and numeracy standards, both compared to where we sit in the world, but also our own performance over time. So students these days are well behind in average years of learning in maths and reading by the time they get to year 9. The other thing that really worries me in the school's data is you see a kind of widening gap in performance from students from a disadvantaged background compared to their more advantaged peers as they progress through school. So they start behind, but the gap widens in both reading and maths as they progress through. So given foundational skills are so important for the capacity to go on to vet and university, this really matters. I often talk about this as like a core productivity driver. The human capital is critical. I know the Minister, is thinking a lot about school education reforms, and there is a lot we can do there. I won't go into the kind of details of things that work, but we do know a lot of the things that work in helping turn that around. But I appreciate that, that's a challenge that providers face if people aren't coming with those basic skills. That just makes everyone's job more difficult.
Great. The next question we've got on Slido, the question is, productivity growth is declining but still positive. Meanwhile, real wage growth is negative. How do workers share in the benefits we're asking them to produce?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So over time, basically wages and productivity move together. So if we take a long-term horizon, productivity is what enables wages growth. You do get some degree of bouncing around, and the questioner is right in the recent period, wages haven't always kept up with productivity. I think some of that is to do with the kind of very strange macro period that we're in. Some of it is to do with the dominance of the mining sector, which distorts a lot of the data. I expect over time that relationship will be restored, but it is critical that that we share the spoils of these productivity gains. But certainly over the long arc of history, that has been the case.
Great. Another question here is, do you think research productivity declines due to a reduction in blue sky funding that could lead to innovations that are more impactful in the long term?
I'm not an expert in this area, but some of the work I've seen and a lot of the innovation work tends to focus on the US system, so I think it's worth saying that, does suggest that the grants processes tend to favour a much sort of narrower or more incremental style of research. By its nature, blue sky research is not necessarily going to give you payoffs. You're taking a bet, and grant processes haven't typically favoured that style of research. So there is kind of evolving thinking around ideas like lotteries and things that could be used where people have these very big ideas and will just randomly spread some money around and kind of see what sticks. And that's, kind of frightening for a government handing out money to think about, because there will be failures, of course, when you're doing that kind of highly speculative blue sky thinking. But I think that's the only way you can think about making sure that we do a mix of incremental stuff, really important, but we also need the kind of big breakthroughs.
Great, thanks. You mentioned international caps, and there are a few questions that have come through about that. One of the questions asks, how will the international caps help productivity, if at all?
Ooh, okay, interesting question. I mean, I'm limited in what I can say on international caps and, largely because we just haven't done the work and I'm not an expert in this area. I mean, the way I think of it is the government's balancing some different objectives. There certainly has been some challenges as borders reopened and we had this kind of big jump up in student numbers and the way that hit the Australian economy and housing markets that had adapted to a world of closed borders. That's kind of the Cobra rat thing I was talking about before. I think that actually would settle down over time. I suppose the argument on the positive side, and I realise that might not be well received in this room, might be around that kind of question of the quality of experience. So, making sure that student numbers are such that the international students that are here can have a really positive experience and they will either tend to go on and participate in the Australian workforce or go back to their country of origin and, hopefully facilitate ongoing ties with Australia. So it may be through the quality piece that you could make an argument that it could boost productivity, but I understand there are lots of challenges with the way it's implemented and people in this room will be feeling that quite acutely.
And I guess I'm interested in whether or not you see the challenges being different for non-university providers. So in terms of the challenges that you're working through, what are the kinds of things that universities should be thinking about, which I think you've given a really good appraisal of? What about non-university providers in the sector?
Again, I will premise it by saying I'm in no way an expert on this sector, but I think clearly the challenge for the non-university providers is they'll often be more exposed to or more dependent on international students, and so these kind of policy decisions will be biting a lot harder. So the kind of question of not right? No, okay, all right. See, this is why I shouldn't weigh into areas where I'm not an expert. But I think the kind of I know at least some of the non-university providers this is true, not all. But so there's a segment of the market where, this kind of goes to the heart of business model questions and how do we innovate and evolve to respond to the regulatory environment. For the other sets of providers, I assume some of the other questions I'm raising around quality, how do you attract and retain the students, will be the things that they'll be turning their minds to.
I'm going to stick with non-university providers, even though it's not your area of expertise, but I am interested in this question that's come through, is in quilt data, often they do better in terms of institutions around student experience, and I think, often it's to do with size, but they're also really good at what they do. Yet resource allocation is sometimes a bit skewed. Do you think an even spread of funding would assist that?
I am just not going there. This is how I get myself in trouble. No, I will leave that one. The observation is right. I suspect it is to do with the more kind of targeted remit of some of them, the smaller size, as you say. It can be quite a different student experience, and obviously in a lot of cases that's viewed very positively by the students, but I will leave all funding questions to the Minister.
Appreciate you giving it a go. There was another really interesting point that you raised about the sharing of course content and curriculum so people can have a visibility and transparency. Can you talk to us about, a little, as an academic, I don't want to do that, but talk us through the thinking and firstly what's beneficial about that, but more of interest would be how do we see that, how do you see that working, and how would that be practical for institutions?
Yeah, so some of the inspiration for this is a number of the universities in the US already do this. I think MIT, Chicago, and there are a number of different motivations. One is the point I've been making around teacher quality, and we can regulate standards and do all sorts of things, but there is something about knowing that your lecturers are going to be online, that they may be viewed by your peers and the other people in the sector, that I think does create an incentive to really do fabulous teaching. Second is around students working out what they want to do. We know that a lot of when you survey students in high school, they have a very narrow set of career aspirations. Like 50% will nominate one of 10 professions. They don't really have a full sense of the extraordinary range of things that you can go on to study and go on to work in, and this idea that putting the course material around there may, an aspiring student may look and get an appetite for something that they didn't even know existed. And the third is just around the opportunity for learning in the population at large. There's a whole set of people out there that would love to be exposed to the fabulous teaching that goes on in universities. They don't want to do an accreditation. So I don't think it's really cannibalising revenue streams in any way. This is a different set of people that otherwise wouldn't be exposed to what you're doing that can benefit from having that learning available. So I know it is a radical proposition. It does happen in some places, and I just think there is a lot of upsides, both for individuals and societies, and for this question of quality and quality teaching that we're talking about.
Another question is around, I don't know if my mic's gone off, PhDs. So those who've gone through, they're the ideas generators often, but there seems to be a reluctance in industry to employ them, largely because we hear about overqualification. How can this trend be changed, or isn't it an accurate assumption?
I mean, I'm going off anecdote. I don't have data, so I'm going off anecdotal evidence, but I think certainly the idea that, getting innovation and links between university and business is not just about commercialisation, it's about the flow of people, is very right. So we absolutely want more of our wonderful PhD students going into industry, going into government. I see this in government as well. So I think it's helping democratise that knowledge to make it seem less scary, perhaps, for the potential employers, helping those students work on explaining what it is they do and why it's relevant. By its nature, once you do a PhD, you can feel very specialised, but the skill set that you've developed and the knowledge that you've developed has broad spillovers. So helping those students tell that story to those potential employers. I think universities and other providers in the sector can play a role in making the links as well, like helping the students find the employers that will match their skill set. And certainly I think there is a lot of opportunity there through that kind of innovation spillover that I was talking about.
The next couple of questions relate to the metrics associated with productivity, or the metric of productivity. The comment here is that it doesn't translate very well into arts-based tertiary education and performance. How do you count really the cultural benefit? Because you mentioned it, but I'm interested how you assess that from your perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've always got to be really clear about the limitations of what these numbers do and can't do. So essentially, when we're measuring productivity, we are measuring outputs in the economy per hours worked. The ABS tries to adjust for quality across a range of areas, and we're kind of good at doing that in areas like new houses, for example. We can adjust for the ways in which houses now are better than they were 30 years ago. Once you start getting into some services sectors, that can be hard. We recently did some work looking at health productivity. If you look at the kind of aggregate numbers, it looks pretty lacklustre. But when you adjust for the fact that people are living longer, healthier lives, we've got better outcomes. Turns out productivity and health is actually pretty good. So there's measurement issues. In the cultural sector, that will be particularly pronounced. I can't imagine the national statistician is able to adjust for the quality of a play or, music quality. So what we'd be seeing is the kind of broader contribution to economic activity, but you wouldn't be picking up those cultural spillovers. So that is what I meant when I said, growth matters, but it's not everything. Like, we pick up a lot of things that we care about, but there is this set of broader things, whether it's, human connection, cultural ties, social cohesion, that we're not going to be able to pick up in those numbers. So numbers matter, but we've got to recognise those benefits too.
Thanks, Danielle. We have time for, you've done a great job answering all these questions, so we all really appreciate it. One of the questions is around the tension of teaching quality and research excellence and what gets prioritised in universities particularly. Often the focus, where there is a focus on research, then quality of teaching kind of suffers. You focused a lot on quality. I'm interested in your reflections on that tension and what we might be able to do about that.
Yeah, it came out in the Accord. I think more generally there is this challenge around, you raised it right at the start, Braden, what is the role of universities? I believe that great teaching needs to be at the heart, as does great research, and I think it feels in some cases like the kind of relative prestige or weight has got out of whack over time. So I think TESCA does a great job at ensuring kind of minimum standards, but I think what I'm talking about is how do we push towards excellence. And so with that, I think about incentives, and some of the things that I was talking about today are geared towards improving the incentives, but I think ways in which we can think of to improve prestige, whether that's more effort on great teaching awards, all sorts of other things that actually recognise the incredible benefit that great teaching provides for the students themselves and for the broader ecosystem of the Australian economy. I would love to find creative ways to really elevate that. And then I think it's when you create that prestige, when you create that excitement, the relative way in people will shift their efforts to recognise that is now a central part of the job of being a university academic.
Brilliant. Final question, and it's the easiest one you'll get, I promise.
Excellent.
What do you enjoy most about your job and what you do? What excites you the most about it?
Oh, I love that question. Partly it's coming to talk to different groups, and I have the privilege of getting to hear from different players in so many different sectors and hearing what it is that gets you guys out of bed in the morning and what motivates you is incredibly inspiring for me. The other thing is ideas, and I talked a lot about ideas today. Policy, just like other aspects in the economy, is ultimately about getting the best ideas and trying to push those ideas forward for the good of the nation. And so if I can learn and put forward, positive sources of change to government, the idea that, we will live in a more prosperous country is incredibly powerful and motivating for me.
Brilliant. Please thank Danielle for a wonderful keynote. Thanks, Danielle. Thank you again, Danielle, and thank you for answering so many questions. We appreciate your time. I'd now like to welcome to the stage Honourable Jason Clare, MP, Minister for Education. Please welcome the Minister to the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Braden. That was the shortest introduction I've ever had, but certainly not the worst. G'day, everybody. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I particularly recognise Dr Mary Russell, Adrian Newenhouse, Danielle Wood, who's just enlightened us here, and I'm so glad I don't have to answer any questions after that. David Turvey, the Executive Director of Jobs and Skills Australia, David Coltman, the Deputy Chair of TAFE Directors Australia, and all of the students who are part of this conversation that we're having here today and yesterday. Out of all of this, I am so glad, Mary, that students are at the heart of this conversation. They're at the heart of everything I'm trying to do as Minister for Education. I'm glad to see that they're at the heart of this as well. 2.5 years ago when I got this job, I said that I didn't want to be the sort of minister that just signed letters, that I wanted to reform the system, to make it better and to make it fairer. And I suspect now that you can see that I meant that. And I hope you can see why in the university's Accord. What it tells us is that by the middle of this century, so only about 25 years away, we're going to need a workforce where 80% of us will have a tertiary qualification, a uni qualification, a TAFE qualification, a vocational qualification. 80%. And that's up from 60% today. And that's a big shift. That's a big change. Some of that will happen organically. When you think about it, the fastest growing professions in Australia today all require some sort of tertiary qualification. But some of that will require us to change what we do and how we do it. The key message that I take out of the Accord is that we're not going to hit that target, that 80% target, unless we break that invisible barrier that stops a lot of young people from walking through your door. And overwhelmingly, those young people are people from poor families, they're people from our outer suburbs, and they're people who live in regional Australia. Breaking down that barrier means not just reforming what we do in higher education, it means reforming our entire education system. Here's the nub of it. At a time where the Accord tells us we need more people to finish school and go to TAFE or go to university, the number of people finishing school is going in the opposite direction. From 85% 8 years ago to 79% today. And that drop in high school completion rates isn't happening everywhere. In non-government schools, it's either pretty flat, pretty much the same as it was 8 years ago, or it's going up. It's happening in our public schools. It's dropped from 83% to 73% in just 8 years. And in particular, it's young people from poor families. And if we're going to hit that 80% target that the Accord talks about, we've got to turn that around. And reform doesn't start at high school either. The same young people that you don't see walking through your doors, the same young people who don't finish high school, are the same young people who fall behind in primary school. They're also the same people who are more likely to start behind in prep or in kindergarten, or to have never been to early education and care at all. Can you see the common thread? Fixing this isn't easy, it won't be quick, it's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take time. But the first parts of it are in the Parliament right now. In the next 2 weeks, 6 pieces of education legislation will be voted on by the Senate. The first is a 15% pay rise for early educators right across the country. Some of the most important workers in this country, and frankly, some of the most underpaid. If we're going to build the sort of early education system that we need, that Danielle's team have told us we need to build, then we need to start by building that workforce. And that's what that legislation's about. The second is a bill to increase funding for our public schools, to complete the work that David Gonski started more than a decade ago. Fully funding all public schools and tying that funding to real and practical reforms to turn around that drop in high school completion rates I talked about. The third bill is another piece of unfinished business. It extends the system of USIs, or unique student identifiers, that every uni student has, that every TAFE student has, to every school student. We've been talking about doing this for 15 years, and now it is finally going to happen. The fourth bill implements the changes we're making to international education. It makes important changes to fix real integrity issues in the system, and it introduces limits or caps on the number of international students. For vet providers, it will mean that they'll be able to enrol about 30% fewer students next year than they did last year. For universities, it's different. It will mean they'll be able to enrol roughly the same number of students next year as they did last year. The difference is it won't just be the big metro universities that benefit. And when that legislation passes, Ministerial Direction 107 will go. I know how important international education is. I know that it doesn't just make us money. I know that it makes us friends, and I know how important that is in the world in which we live. But I also know we've got to get the balance right here. And we've got to remember what the primary and most important job our universities do is. And that brings me to the fifth bill. This is the bill that implements the first stage of the Universities Accord. It includes almost $500 million in extra investment to create paid prac. The first time that the Commonwealth Government has ever done this. That's financial support for teaching and nursing and midwifery and social work students to support them while they do the practical part of their degree. I'm sure you've heard this. A lot of students have told me that when they do their prac, they sometimes have to give up their part-time job, or they've got to move away from home or work fewer hours. And that can sometimes mean that some people delay finishing their degree and some don't finish at all. This will give people who've signed up to do some of the most important jobs in this country a little bit of extra help to get the qualifications that they need and that we need. And just to give you one example of what I think this means, earlier this year I met a midwifery student at UTS, and this is what she told me. Quote, "I'm a first-year mature-age midwifery student. This payment is going to be absolutely life-changing for me. As a mother of 2 small children, I'm often balancing between practical work, placement, and looking after my babies. There are literally some days where I'm doing 16 hours a day between my study and my work and looking after my children. I can't wait for this payment to be available for myself and for other mature-age students who might also want to enrol in this course who previously couldn't financially afford to do it." That's what this reform is all about. This is also the bill that will massively expand the number of free enabling courses. You know, I suspect what I'm talking about here. These are those free courses that universities offer that are effectively a bridge between school and university. A lot of universities already offer them. Not many do it better than the University of Newcastle. This year they celebrate 50 years of doing this. More than 70,000 students, graduates of the University of Newcastle have been through this Open Foundation program. 1 in 5 graduates from the University of Newcastle every year start with one of these free enabling courses. People like Jennifer Baker. Jennifer was a mum at the age of 19 and she worked in hospitality for 10 years. And then one day she saw an ad in the local paper for one of these free courses. Now she's got a science degree and an honours degree and a PhD and a Fulbright scholarship. She's a computational medicinal chemist. That's what these courses do. And what this bill does is effectively uncap funding for these courses right across the country. We've committed an extra $350 million over the next 4 years to significantly expand these courses, and it's an ongoing commitment. Universities currently receive as little as $1,286 per place to run these courses. These changes will ensure that universities will receive $18,278 per place, tied to CPI. It provides the sort of funding certainty that universities need to significantly expand what I want to do here. It deals with the disincentives that are currently baked into the system, and most importantly, it makes sure that these courses are free. It'll help more Australians, sort of Australians I spoke about earlier, that aren't walking through your doors at the moment, that aren't getting a crack at university, to walk through your door. My department estimates that this will increase the number of people doing these free courses by about 40% by the end of this decade and double that number by the end of the decade after that. This is also the bill that fixes how HECS debts are indexed, or at least what we used to call HECS. It fixes what happened last year when inflation spiked and indexation went through the roof, and it makes sure that that can never happen again. To do this, it caps indexation at either inflation or the wage price index, whatever is the lowest. and it backdates this change to June last year. That on its own will wipe about $3 billion of student debt for more than 3 million Australians. But it's just the first step in making HECS fairer. As you know, a bit over a week ago, the Prime Minister announced that if we win the next election, the first piece of legislation that we will introduce will cut all student debts by a further 20%. For someone with an average student debt of around $27,000 today, the legislation that's currently in the Parliament will wipe about $1,200 off that debt. The announcement that we made just over a week ago will wipe a further $5,500 off it. That's real help for a lot of young Australians just out of uni or just out of TAFE, just moved out of home, just getting started. We also announced that we will make another change to make it easier for people to pay off their student debt. We'll increase the salary that you have to earn before you start paying it off from $54,000 to $67,000, and we'll reduce annual repayments. For someone on about $70,000 a year, this will mean that you'll have to repay about $1,300 less a year than you currently have to. It's another recommendation of the Universities Accord. In fact, it's a recommendation of the architect of HECS, Professor Bruce Chapman. The fact is, university today is a lot more expensive than it was when most of us were university students. When HECS was first created with the help of Professor Chapman, students paid on average about 24% towards the cost of a degree. And that increased to about 36% in the late 1990s. And now, because of changes that the previous government has made, it's around about 45%. Cutting student debt by 20% fixes that for a generation of Australians. But there is more to do, and that includes changing the way that we fund universities. Part of that is uncapping the number of places at university for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who get the marks for the courses they want to do. Part of that is a new needs-based funding system, so these same students get all of the extra academic and wraparound support that they need to succeed when they get there. And part of that is a new Australian Tertiary Education Commission, a steward to help drive reform over the long term. I hope to be able to provide you with more detail on all of that before the end of this year. Finally, the sixth bill that I want the Senate to pass in the next 2 weeks creates a national student ombudsman. When I was at this conference last year, I talked about the scourge of sexual violence in our universities, and I said that change was coming, and change is coming. What we are establishing here in this bill is a dedicated national body to handle student complaints within our higher education system, equipped with the power to investigate complaints, to bring parties together to resolve issues, including offering restorative engagement processes and alternative dispute resolution where appropriate, to make findings and recommendations on what actions universities should take, and to monitor the implementation of those recommendations. It'll also have the sort of investigative powers that you would expect a Royal Commission to have. That includes the power to require a person or a university to provide information, documents and other records relevant to an investigation, to enter premises in a university as part of an investigation, and to require a person to attend and answer questions before the Ombudsman. Recent events at St Paul's College in Sydney remind us how important this work is. Again, it is another recommendation of the Universities Accord. And it's not just about responding to sexual violence in our universities. It'll be able to investigate everything from complaints about homophobia to anti-Semitism to Islamophobia to any form of racism or discrimination. And this will complement the important work that TEXA does. A couple of weeks ago, I was with Dr. Russell and the team at TEXA. for a meeting that they organised with Vice-Chancellors across the country, as well as the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism and the Race Discrimination Commissioner. And it was focused on the lessons from the last few months, sharing best practices between universities and the work that we need to do together to help to ensure that students and staff are safe and feel safe on campus. As part of this, TEXA is currently developing sector guidance and a statement of regulatory expectations for Australian higher education providers to help manage contested issues and protests and improve complaints and grievance services. And can I thank you, Mary, and thank the whole team at TEXA for this important work that you're doing. Can I also thank you and the whole team for bringing us together today and yesterday to grapple with everything from good governance to generative AI and to talk about what's next. That's, in a sense, what our universities are about, what they've always been about. What's next? What this conference calls navigating tomorrow. I've talked a little bit about that today, but really it's just the start. There's a lot to navigate and there's a lot to do to make our education system better and fairer than it is today. And if we get this right, to make our country better and fairer too. It's what makes, I think, my job so important that I get it right, and such a privilege to hold. It's one that I will never, ever take for granted. Thank you so much for the privilege to talk to you today.
Thank you, Minister Clare, for your remarks. It's fantastic to hear an update on the fantastic work that's underpinning the Accord. And as a Noongar leader in a university, I have nothing but great respect for the work we're doing enabling education. I'm a beneficiary of that. And to see that rolled out nationally will make a considerable difference. We will continue to enjoy working with the government on a whole range of fantastic things. Also, as a teacher, prac payments would have been fantastic too, so we're delighted to see a whole range of things. Please thank the Minister again for the update. Okay, one of the things I'm really excited to tell you about is we've extended your morning tea and lunchtime because we're all about connection and relationships. In an age of AI, we want people to connect. We don't want the death screen Zoom situation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a task. I want you to think about two things. The first, in Noongar, it's a borona, which is a tree, and a bilya, which is a river. So think about those two things, tree and river. My colleagues are going, Braden, how many times do you have to do this? But we're doing it. Think about those two things, and then I want you, if you don't know the person next to you, to introduce yourself and then explain which of those two things most resonate with you, your personality, and who you are. Tree or river? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. Please go. Okay. All right, can I have that back, please? Can I have the attention, please? My teacher stare is not working. Colleagues, I really should have stipulated how much connection I wanted you to make. I should have put a limit on that. as I mentioned, we are now breaking for morning tea, so please continue that connection and conversation out in the Sophie's Lounge outside, and I think we've also opened up the Latrobe room, which is upstairs as well. So we'll see you back here at 11 o'clock. Thanks very much, everybody.